Welcome to the Own It Powercast, the place to be when you get serious about making big changes and accelerating growth in your life and in your relationships. Finally create the life you've always wanted, living life on your own terms. Learn how to take your fear and turn it into powerful choices that will create sustained change. Now your host, Mary Baker.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Own It Powercast, the place to come to get what you need to move yourself forward. Hey, it's Mary Baker and welcome to episode 320, Why Negotiating Needs Feels So Hard, and what it reveals about your boundaries. Well, welcome to a brand new month, and I want to start this episode by saying something really important, and that we've talked before about emotional safety, trust, and why communication can feel so hard in relationships. And of course, I think these concepts are so important. So yeah, I'm going to be bringing them up often. But today's episode is a little different than what we've been talking about recently. Because instead of focusing on what's happening between people, we're going to focus on what's happening inside of you when you try to speak up. When negotiating needs feels uncomfortable, when it feels overwhelming or sometimes even scary, it's really easy to assume that that means the relationship itself might be unsafe. And sometimes that's very true. But sometimes what's actually being revealed is that you were never taught how to have boundaries around your needs, even with yourself. So this month, we're not just talking about communication. We're going to be talking about boundaries, choice, and what emotional maturity actually looks like when you're under pressure. And if you've ever known what you needed but didn't know how to say it or felt guilty the moment you tried, then this episode might be really helpful for you. Okay, let's get into it. So why negotiating needs can feel threatening. Negotiating needs doesn't feel hard typically because you're bad at communication. So let's get that one out of the way. It feels hard because needs expose your boundaries and you. And this is what we're going to get into this week. So these are needs, not wants. I think Maslow's done a great job of creating a hierarchy of needs. Those of you who aren't familiar with that, go online. There is plenty written about that. But basically his concept was, first we need to be able to breathe and be able to eat and survive, and then we need to feel safe, and then everything else is built on top of that. But he was the first one to really talk a lot about emotional and psychological needs, and those are the ones we're going to kind of focus on this month here. And it is fascinating to me, but not surprising, how disconnected you can be from what you need and not even realize that. Because you've perfected, shall we say, the concept of disowning, disconnecting from what you need. Now, why would we do that? Because a long time ago, maybe we learned that our needs will activate our fear of certain things. And the first one is conflict. Your past experiences with conflict maybe didn't need to be physically crazy for you to have fear around it. More likely, it was more passive-aggressive in a loving family, like shaming or with some emotional abuse on many different levels of severity. So it wasn't going to go well. And if you can't remember details, don't worry about it. I just want you to pay attention to, when I look back on my relationships early on in life, what was the vibe? The other fear you can have is of disappointment. Maybe your experiences in the past were with people who weren't mature or healthy enough to not drop that ball in a hard conversation. And I've done enough family sessions over the years to watch that happen in excruciatingly slow motion, let me tell you. It's very difficult to watch, but also makes perfect sense. So they couldn't do it. And so they couldn't validate what you were asking for. They couldn't validate you. And they couldn't normalize asking for what you need. So you don't want to be disappointed again. Maybe the fear was of being too much. Like somehow you got the vibe that what you were asking for was ridiculous. Some people were actually told that explicitly. Or maybe just impossible to meet because, people are stressed and overwhelmed and too busy martyring themselves to be there for you. Yes, I'm being snarky, but sadly accurate in some situations. And you asking in a healthy way probably also really triggered their own inability to ask for what they need. And you've heard me say a million times, we're not going to let other people do what we can't. And finally, the fear of being seen as selfish. So the messaging was focused on others, putting other people's needs first, denying yourself, being selfless. And don't draw attention to what you need. Don't be vulnerable. It was way too risky. And how dare you? And who do you think you are? And so it created all these distorted beliefs that you're unkind, you're not thinking of others if you ask for what you need, that it's selfish and how dare you. Plus, if you have really immature parents and probably older siblings, if you had immature parents, there probably wasn't a whole lot of room for what you needed. And they couldn't step up and be there for you, even imperfectly. So for many people, the reason negotiating needs feels so hard has very little to do with adulthood and has everything to do with what we learned early on. Now, caveat that with, and we've talked about this before, if you had folks like that in your family, you probably continue to put people like that in your life, subconsciously. And so you just continued the pattern and didn't know any different, if that makes sense. So needs caused tension. Maybe you expressed a need as a child and the room got tense. Maybe voices changed. Maybe faces tightened. Maybe someone sighed or withdrew. What's important to know is nothing dramatic had to happen for your nervous system to learn the message, my needs make things harder. So you adapted. Maybe you became easier, maybe quieter, more accommodating, or on the other end of the spectrum, you waited until you were good and pissed and you acted out. And you lashed out or you melted down. Or you got upset about something completely disconnected. And now as an adult, that same tension shows up in your body before you even open your mouth. Maybe your needs were ignored or punished. Maybe you spoke and nothing changed. That's something that happens in families all the time, and it's not talked about enough. Well-meaning families. They might have listened to what you needed, but they didn't really do anything to make changes in the family to meet your need. And so you learn not to trust that people can really listen and that things can be different. Or worse, you were shamed for having those needs. You were given the sense, either directly or indirectly, that you're too sensitive, you're too needy, you're too much. And when that happens repeatedly, you don't stop having needs, you just stop trusting them. The needs don't go anywhere. Trust me, as a therapist and a coach for many years, they don't go anywhere. You just learn to second guess yourself. You learn to minimize and rationalize, to tell yourself you're asking too much, when you're actually just asking for the bare minimum. Maybe growing up needs had to be earned. That needs were conditional. You could have them, but only if you were good. Only if you were helpful, compliant, maybe successful, low maintenance. They didn't have to worry about you too much. And so care became something you actually worked for. And love became something you performed for. And in adult relationships, this shows up as overfunctioning, over-explaining, and feeling guilty the moment you ask for anything at all. When you grow up with any version of this, negotiating needs doesn't feel like communication, it feels like risk. Not because you're immature or needy, but because your nervous system learned that needs had consequences. And when you grow up learning that your needs create problems, well, guess what? Of course, your nervous system treats negotiation like danger, even in adulthood. And that's why we really need to clarify a few things, like needs versus demands. A need is just information. It tells you something true about what supports your well-being, not what someone else is required to do. A demand, however, is pressure. It tries to control the outcome because there isn't enough safety, trust, or tolerance for uncertainty. That's when you yell at someone and say, "Stop doing that," as opposed to, "Hey, it works better for me if you don't do that." Now, a boundary is responsibility. A boundary clarifies what you will do to take care of yourself, regardless of how someone else responds. Healthy needs don't require someone else to change per se. They require clarity about what you will do if, for whatever reason, your need isn't met. So, for example, I need consistency versus you need to text me back. The you need to text me back is focused on trying to change them. The I need consistency is you just telling them information about you. I need rest versus you should understand. Let's talk more about what are healthy needs. And I often tell clients, I don't think we can talk about needs without talking about boundaries because I think they go hand in hand. And let me give you some examples of what I mean by that. So let's say the need is emotional safety, which it's not a want, guys. It's a need. We all need it. And so the boundary would be something like, I don't stay in conversations where I'm going to be mocked or dismissed or punished for being honest. That's my boundary. Another need we all have is for respect. So the boundary would be, I address disrespect directly or I disengage instead of explaining it away. And what about the need for rest and recovery? The boundary would look something like, I say no to commitments that exceed my capacity. Even, here comes detachment, if others are disappointed. And what about autonomy? The boundary would be, I make decisions without over-explaining or asking for permission to choose what's right for me. It's kind of crazy when you say it out loud, huh? Permission to choose. And another need is consistency. And the boundary would be, I don't keep adjusting myself to unpredictable or unreliable behavior. That's a big one that creates a lot of trust issues in relationships and a lot of stress. Not that we're asking people to be perfect, but we're asking for someone who is consistent. Another big need is being heard and considered. So the boundary here would be, I notice whether my input actually matters. And you know what? I stop over-functioning when it doesn't. What about the need for time and space to process something? The boundary would be, so I pause conversations instead of forcing some clarity under pressure just because they want an answer from me right now. Doesn't mean I have one. And if you have experiences like we've talked about today in your past, it probably does take you a while to process because first you have to get out of your limbic system and feel safe and engage your prefrontal cortex in order to think things through. So yeah, you're going to need to step away and you're going to need more time than the next guy at first. What about the need for mutual effort? Well, the boundary there is, I don't carry relationships that require me to do all the emotional labor. There's a big one. The need for honesty. The boundary is, look, I don't collude with any denial, secrecy, or half-truths just to keep the peace. I'm courageous enough to not participate in that and lose friendships or other relationships over it. And finally, the need for choice. My favorite word. The boundary is, I remind myself that I'm allowed to renegotiate, I'm allowed to change my mind, and I'm allowed to say no. These are needs. They're not wants. They're not excessive. They're human. And if we don't get them met, we're going to act out in ways to get them met sideways. We know that. And boundaries aren't necessarily walls. I think they can be a structure that just allows your needs to exist without turning into resentment or self-abandonment. And that's why I think they go hand in hand. So let's talk about what your response to needs reveals about your boundaries. And some of these might be hard to hear. Some of these you probably already know. Or maybe they're hidden for the first time. It's all good. So what about if you over-explain? Well, that usually means you have weak internal boundaries. You're trying to earn permission for your need from them instead of trusting inside yourself that it's valid. And saying no to yourself where you have this urge to get permission from them. You would say, no, that's what I've decided. That's my truth. That's it. What if you give in, you collapse really quickly? Well, it means a fear of rupture. So keeping the relationship intact feels a hell of a lot safer than staying connected to yourself, as crazy as it sounds. And so as you work on self-love and self-trust, this goes down. You stop doing this over time. You start valuing you and your well-being over a relationship that probably isn't healthy enough anyway. And finally, if you avoid negotiating, well, it often means learned helplessness or over-accommodating, like we talked about here. So past experiences taught you that speaking up either wouldn't matter or is going to cost you so much more than it was worth. That's your perception. So it's not your fault. If you struggle with any of these I just mentioned, they come from experiences in your past. And it's not just you. You did not invent this. And so your discomfort around having needs doesn't mean you're needy. It just means you don't yet trust yourself to hold your ground. And those are very changeable things and things I help people work on all the time. So choice is, I think, at the heart of any mature communication. And this is what I teach week after week. Because healthy communication means you can pause. You can stop trying to control the moment and the outcome. You have the ability to say and hear no. You believe that no can actually be very healthy and is not used to control anyone. It's about your boundaries, your discipline, your self-love. The ability to renegotiate, to maybe be flexible without going against yourself. Being okay taking others' needs into account as well and try to find a solution that works for both of you. And remember, if you don't feel like you're in a place of choice in that conversation, I don't think you're negotiating, you're complying. And you're feeling like a hostage. Because when communication comes from obligation instead of choice, resentment isn't a failure, it's a real signal that it's not okay. Okay, when is the struggle about the relationship and not you? Because we got to talk about this too. Negotiating needs should feel safer over time, but if it consistently leads to like defensiveness, like they're being reactive and immature, if there's any kind of punishment, not okay. And this can range from, I think, more benign ignoring you or pouting or stomping away or acting out all the way to severe, like those narcissistic traits, like melting down, shaming you, playing the victim, causing big problems. You should not get punished for asking for what you need. Withdrawal, emotionally mainly. And it's disrespectful and invalidating, like the one-word answers, the going quiet on text, like not turning towards you to share. Their demeanor instantly changes, and it's unhealthy because it teaches you, A, they can't handle it, but B, you're not safe asking for what you need. And then guilt and manipulation, like that should be a no-brainer. That's not okay. That's abusive. Should not be happening. And so it's not so much a skill issue on your part, it's a relational boundary issue. You know, in healthier relationships, not perfect, but healthier, needs can be discussed without someone needing to protect power, avoid accountability, or control the emotional outcome. And healthy relationships never require you to disappear in order to stay connected. Remember that. So over the next few weeks, we're going to keep building on this. We're going to talk about how boundaries support your needs, how detachment gives you choice, and how clear agreements can take the emotional charge out of, I think, should be everyday conversations. And clarity isn't cold. It's what makes, I think, connection possible without abandoning yourself. So this week, I just want you to take a moment and notice where you have a need, big or small, And just pay attention to what happens inside of you before you even speak. Do you start to get tense? Do you find yourself rushing to explain? Do you have so much anxiety about it? Like, do you literally talk yourself out of it? That reaction isn't something to judge. It's really valuable information, and it's exactly where your boundary work begins and your healing work. So today we talked about why negotiating needs can feel so uncomfortable, especially in relationships that matter to you. And we talked about the struggle to speak up isn't always about communication skills, but about our discomfort and how that reveals our struggle with boundaries. It reveals everyone's emotional maturity and internal safety. And so today we didn't focus so much on what other people are doing or not doing. We talked more about what's going on inside of you and why your early experiences absolutely shaped your relationship with your needs. Then we talked about how to tell the difference between needs and demands and boundaries, and why if you have recurring reactions like guilt and over-explaining and shutting down, they're not flaws, they're just signals that you didn't have experiences early on, making it easy for you to ask for what you need. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I hope you walked away with something helpful. Pass this along to folks who you know can also benefit. If you need some coaching around this is what I do, guys. This is what I work with people every week. And I love to see the change. Hit the link in the show notes, reach out, even if you just want to talk about talking about it. Okay? All right. So pay it forward. Keep focusing on you. Ask for what you need. And I'll see you next time.
We hope you took away some useful insights and tools you could begin using right away. If you did, please leave a positive review and share on your social media. Because could you imagine if everyone in your life really got it together? Remember, own it now, so you can really own it later.